Close your eyes and imagine a quiet forest in the heart of Turkey. Beneath the roots and soil, the ruins of an ancient city sleep in silence. Its gates, once carved with lions and sphinxes, now crumble into dust. Its walls, once towering, are covered in moss and shadow. This was Hattusa. And long ago, it was the beating heart of an empire now almost forgotten, the Hittites. They were once equals to Egypt, rivals of Babylon, and masters of Anatolia. Yet for centuries, their story was erased. Their name was lost. Only the whisper of broken stones remained, as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. Tonight, we will slowly turn the fragile pages of their story. We will wander through their temples, listen to their gods, and witness their kings rise and fall. And finally, we will stand with them in their moment of silence, when the world around them collapsed. This is not just the history of a people, it is the memory of an empire that tried to defy time. A memory that still lingers in the night air, waiting to be heard. Long before the Hittites carved their name into history, another people lived in these lands. They were the Hatti. Farmers, herders, builders of small towns. They raised cattle on the high plains, grew grain in the valleys, and worshipped gods tied to the storm and the soil. Then, around 4,000 years ago, strangers arrived. They came not as conquerors at first, but as wanderers, Indo-European tribes, carrying languages that would one day become Greek, Latin, Sanskrit. They brought with them new weapons, chariots, and the ambition of kingship. At first, they mingled quietly with the Hatti. They learned their ways, adopted their gods, even married into their families. But soon, they began to rise. They forged alliances, they fought wars, and slowly, they shaped a new identity. They were not fully Hatti and not purely Indo-European. They were something in between, something new. The world would come to know them as the Hittites. In their earliest days, they lived in scattered towns, Kusara, Kanesh, Zalpua. One king, named Anita, grew powerful enough to challenge all others. He destroyed the city of Hattusa and left behind a curse, declaring that no one should ever rebuild upon its ashes. Yet, history delights in irony. For only a generation later, another ruler ignored that curse. He rebuilt Hattusa, made it his capital, and named himself Hattusili, man of Hattusa. It was here, among rocky plateaus and winding rivers, that the Hittite kingdom took root. Hattusa was not just a city, it was a fortress of stone, a maze of walls, gates, and towers. Within its clay tablets, written in the wedge-shaped script of Mesopotamia, the Hittites began to record their laws, their treaties, and their prayers. Their voices, pressed into clay, would outlast their empire itself. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the Hittites was not their wars, nor their walls, but their gods. The Hittites did not worship a single deity, nor even a small pantheon. They were known as the people of 1,000 gods. Every city had its own divine protector. Every mountain, every river, every storm was a living force. The storm god Tarhunt reigned above all, hurling his thunderbolts across the sky. Beside him was the sun goddess of Arina, radiant and eternal. But their pantheon was not pure, it was borrowed, reshaped, and blended. The Hittites adopted gods from Mesopotamia, Syria, even Egypt. Their empire was a tapestry of faith, woven from every culture they touched. This vast collection of deities was more than religion. It was a tool of empire. When the Hittites conquered a city, they did not destroy its gods, they welcomed them. They placed new idols in their temples, gave them a place in their rituals, and declared them part of the family of heaven. By so doing, they tied their empire together not with chains, but with shared worship. Life in early Hittite society was hard, yet surprisingly advanced. Their laws reveal a people practical and pragmatic. Unlike many neighbors, their legal codes were not always harsh. Where others demanded death for theft, the Hittites often asked for restitution repayment rather than execution. Women, too, held notable influence. Queens bore the title Tawanana and acted as high priestesses, equal partners in the rituals of kingship. And from the shadows of their society came something else, a secret knowledge that would one day change the world. The Hittites were among the first to master the forging of iron. In their workshops, Hidden in the valleys of Anatolia, blacksmiths hammered out blades stronger than bronze, harder, sharper, and far more enduring. It was the beginning of the Iron Age, and the Hittites were at its dawn. For a moment in history, they were small, just one kingdom among many. But their roots were deep, their ambitions vast, and their gods many. The winds over Hattusa carried the scent of empire, and the whispers of kings yet to come. In the stillness of the night, if you listen closely, you may almost hear them, the creak of a wooden chariot rolling across stone, the chant of a priestess calling down the storm, the distant echo of hammers striking iron. This was the beginning, the first footsteps of the Hittites in Anatolia, and from these footsteps would rise an empire that, for a time, would rival the greatest powers of the ancient world. The story of the Hittites truly begins with one man. His name was Hattusili, which means the man of Hattusa. By taking this name, he declared not only his throne, but his defiance against a curse. For generations, people remembered the words of King Anita of Kusara. Anita had burned the city of Hattusa and cursed its ruins. Whoever builds here again, may the storm god strike him down. But centuries later, Hattusili ignored the warning. He rebuilt the city, he raised new walls, stronger than before, and made Hattusa the beating heart of his kingdom. To rebuild upon a cursed city was not simply an act of pride, it was a statement of destiny. Hattusili proclaimed that the gods favoured him, that no curse could bind his reign, and indeed, under his rule, the Hittite kingdom began its transformation from a collection of towns into an empire. Hattusili was not content to guard his capital alone. He was a man of restless ambition, his eyes fixed on distant lands, the mountains of Anatolia, the valleys of Syria, the trade routes that carried tin and silver, all these called to him. For in the ancient world, power was not measured only by soldiers, but by control of trade. The Hittites craved what their neighbours held: metals, horses, grain, and the prestige of sacred cities. Hattusili marched his armies south, through rugged passes and fertile plains, toward the lands of the Amorites and beyond. His campaigns stretched far, reaching into the rich lands of northern Syria. Here lay cities that had long been under the influence of Mesopotamian kings: Aleppo, Carchemish, Ebla. Each one had its walls, its own gods, its own traditions, and each one trembled at the coming of the Hittite chariot. The Hittites were masters of war, not simply because of their courage, but because of their technology. By Hattusili's time, they had refined the war chariot into a weapon of speed and precision. Unlike the heavier chariots of Mesopotamia, the Hittite design placed the axle at the rear, allowing greater balance and maneuverability. This meant that Hittite warriors could wheel quickly in battle, hurling spears and shooting arrows with deadly accuracy. On the plains of Syria, these swift machines of war spread terror among their enemies. But power, for Hattusili, was not built only on conquest. He knew the strength of his empire rested on loyalty. Loyalty from his nobles, from his soldiers, and even from his own family. The king's court was both magnificent and dangerous. Allies could turn to rivals, and rivals to enemies, in a heartbeat. Hattusili understood this well. In one of the most striking episodes of his life, he recorded his struggles in what is known as his testament. This was no ordinary document. It was a confession, a reflection, and perhaps even a warning to those who would follow him. In it, he described the betrayals of his kin, the disloyalty of his family, and the burden of ruling in a world of shifting loyalties. He did not paint himself as a flawless hero. Instead, he admitted to failure, to anger, to the pain of betrayal. Few kings in the ancient world left such a human record of their inner life. Through these words, preserved on clay tablets, we glimpse the man behind the crown, not only a conqueror, but a father, a judge, and a weary soul seeking to secure his legacy. Under Hattusili's rule, Hattusa blossomed into a true capital. The city was encircled by walls stretching 6 kilometers, with monumental gates guarded by stone lions. Inside, temples rose with altars to the 1,000 gods of the Hittites. The royal palace loomed above, a place where scribes pressed treaties and laws into clay. It was here that the Hittites began to establish themselves as masters of diplomacy. They were not content with swords alone. They bound allies with treaties, sealed oaths in the names of gods, and demanded loyalty from vassal kings. When a treaty was sworn, it was not merely between men, it was guaranteed by the divine. Breaking an oath meant inviting the wrath of the heavens. This blending of war, law, and religion was a hallmark of Hittite power, and it was Hattusili who set the precedent. He carved into the heart of his empire a belief that the king was not only a warrior, but also the chief priest, standing between gods and men. Yet, even in his strength, Hattusili's reign was troubled. Toward the end of his life, illness weakened him, and the question of succession tore at the stability he had built. His children, his relatives, and his generals each had ambitions of their own. In his testament, he bitterly accused members of his own household of betrayal. It was a reminder that even the greatest king could not command loyalty from every heart. Still, before his death, Hattusili ensured that his throne would not fall into chaos. He adopted his grandson, Murshili, and named him heir. It was a bold decision, for Murshili was young, barely a boy, yet Hattusili trusted that the gods who had guided him would protect his line. And so, as the old king closed his eyes for the last time, the empire he had forged stood firm. The Hittites were no longer a fragile kingdom clinging to survival. They were an empire, with walls, temples, chariots, and ambition stretching across Anatolia and into the lands beyond. In the stillness of night, let us remember Hattusili not only as a conqueror, but as a man who dared to build upon cursed ground. He turned ashes into a capital. He forged loyalty through both fear and faith, and he laid the foundation of a dynasty that would carry the Hittites into an age of glory and, eventually, into confrontation with the might of Egypt itself. But that is a tale for another night. When night fell upon Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite world, the city did not sleep. From within its many temples, torches flickered, drums sounded, and priests whispered prayers that rose like smoke into the dark Anatolian sky. This was a city alive not only with people, but with gods. For the Hittites were known throughout the ancient world as the people of 1,000 gods. It was not a metaphor. They truly believed that the divine lived everywhere, on every mountain, in every river, in every storm. Each town, each valley, each corner of their empire had its own guardian spirit, and rather than forcing their subjects to abandon their deities, the Hittites welcomed them. When they conquered a city, they carried its gods home, placed their statues in the temples of Hattusa, and added their names to the endless list of divinity. The result was a pantheon, unlike any other, a vast, ever-growing family of divine beings. Here, side by side, storm gods from Syria mingled with sun deities of Anatolia. Gods of fertility stood next to Mesopotamian idols borrowed from Babylon. The Hittites were not concerned with purity. They were concerned with inclusion. Every god had a place. At the heart of this divine assembly stood Tarhunt, the storm god. He was the bringer of rain, the hurler of thunderbolts, the guardian of the harvest, and the protector of kings. When storms broke across the Anatolian plateau, the Hittites believed it was Tarhunt riding his chariot across the clouds, brandishing his mighty weapon. His presence was fierce, but also life-giving. Without his rain, the crops withered and the people starved. Beside him shone the sun, goddess of Arina, a radiant figure associated with light, order, and justice. She was not simply a goddess of the sky, but the moral compass of the Hittite world. Kings swore oaths in her name. Treaties were sealed beneath her gaze. If the storm god embodied strength, the sun goddess embodied balance. Together, they ruled the heavens as a divine pair, but the Hittites did not stop there. They honored the moon, the mountains, the rivers. They prayed to Ishtar from Mesopotamia, to Resheph from Syria, to deities of foreign lands that most empires would have rejected as rivals. In Hattusa, they were not rivals, they were family. Religion for the Hittites was not just belief, it was ritual. Day after day, priests and priestesses carried out ceremonies with precision and care. Some rituals took place in temples, where incense rose and libations of wine and oil were poured onto sacred altars. Others were held in open-air sanctuaries, carved into the rock itself. One of the most mysterious of these places lies near Hattusa, at Yazilikaya. There, on the cliffs, the Hittites carved rows of gods in procession. Each figure is etched in stone. Storm gods, sun gods, underworld deities, each walking toward the great rulers of heaven. In the silence of that place, one can still imagine the ceremonies, priests in white robes chanting as the summer sun sank behind the hills, shadows dancing across the stone as torches were lit. The rituals were not merely for show, they were acts of survival. The Hittites believed that the gods required constant attention. If the offerings ceased, if the prayers were forgotten, then famine, disease, or defeat in battle would surely follow. The empire's very survival depended on keeping the gods content. At the center of these rituals stood the king and queen. The king was not only a warrior and judge, he was also the chief priest. It was his duty to act as the bridge between the human and the divine. When he led armies, he called on the storm god for victory. When he judged disputes, he invoked the sun goddess for fairness. Even in his private life, the king was never free of sacred responsibility. Yet it was often the queens who left the deepest mark on Hittite religion. Bearing the title Tawanana, the queen was the highest-ranking priestess in the land. She presided over major ceremonies, kept the temples in order, and ensured the endless cycle of offerings continued. Centuries later, one queen in particular would shine brightly. Puruhepa, wife of King Hattusili III, she reorganized the entire pantheon, creating order out of the chaos of hundreds of gods. In her prayers, she spoke with a voice both intimate and commanding, calling the gods not just as distant powers, but as partners in the survival of her people. Her words still survive, etched on clay tablets, a rare voice of a woman echoing across 3,000 years. Among the rituals that most reveal the heart of the Hittites is the Puruli festival. Held each spring, it celebrated the victory of the storm god over the serpent of chaos. The myth told of Iliyanka, a dragon that once defeated the storm god. But through cunning and ritual, the god returned, struck down the serpent, and restored order to the world. Each year, the people reenacted this drama, ensuring that chaos would never triumph, that the cycles of nature would continue. In their eyes, it was not myth alone, it was renewal, woven into the very survival of their crops and their kingdom. What is striking about Hittite religion is not only its breadth, but its humility. They did not imagine their gods as remote, perfect beings. Their deities quarreled, grew jealous, and even abandoned their people at times. In their myths, when the storm god grew angry and left his land, drought and despair followed. Priests would search for him through rituals, entreating him to return. The relationship between human and divine was fragile, delicate, always in need of attention. And yet, it was this fragility that made their faith so human, so relatable. The Hittites saw the world not as fixed and certain, but as something constantly in balance between order and chaos, between storm and sun, between loyalty and betrayal. Their gods were not distant, they were near, woven into every corner of life. Tonight, as we drift in thought, we can almost picture it. A great hall lit with torches, the king and queen in solemn robes, a priest chanting beside them. Outside, thunder rolls over the plateau, echoing like the footsteps of Tarhunt himself. And in the sacred silence that follows, a whisper lingers. The 1,000 gods of Hatti, restless and eternal, watching over the empire they once called their own. In the long, winding history of the Hittites, there is one king whose name shines brighter than all others. His reign was bold, ambitious, and filled with triumphs. He was Suppiluliuma I, remembered as the greatest conqueror the Hittite Empire ever knew. By the time Suppiluliuma rose to power in the 14th century BCE, the Hittite kingdom had endured centuries of struggle. It had faced civil wars, foreign invasions, and moments where its survival seemed uncertain. But with him, the empire did not merely survive, it surged forward with strength and cunning. Suppiluliuma did not inherit a peaceful throne. His father, Tudaliya III, had left the kingdom weakened by enemies on every side. The Arzawa lands in western Anatolia threatened rebellion. In the south, the kingdom of Kizzuwatna sought independence. And in the east, the powerful Mitanni Empire loomed like a storm, controlling the rich lands of northern Syria. Many rulers might have tried to preserve what they had, but Suppiluliuma was not content with mere survival. He was determined to carve a place for the Hittites among the great powers of the world. His campaigns began close to home. With carefully planned strikes, he subdued rebellious Anatolian lords, reclaiming lands that had drifted from Hittite control. He secured alliances through treaties and marriages, ensuring that his borders were not only defended by armies, but by bonds of blood and oath. But it was to the south that his ambitions truly turned. Beyond the mountains lay Syria, a land of wealthy cities, fertile fields, and vital trade routes. For generations, these lands had been ruled by Mitanni kings, but their grip was loosening. Suppiluliuma seized the chance. He led his armies across the passes and struck at the Syrian heartland. One by one, the great cities fell. Carchemish, Aleppo, Kadesh, names that had echoed for centuries in Mesopotamian records now bowed to the Hittites. Chariots thundered across the plains, and the once mighty Mitanni were forced to retreat. In less than a generation, Suppiluliuma had transformed his kingdom from a regional state into an empire stretching across Anatolia and deep into the Levant. The Hittites now stood shoulder to shoulder with Egypt and Assyria, the giants of their age. Yet, what made Suppiluliuma remarkable was not only his victories, but his vision. He understood that conquest without diplomacy was fragile. So he combined the sword with the treaty. He placed his sons as rulers over key cities, one in Carchemish, another in Aleppo, ensuring loyalty by blood. He bound local kings with treaties, sworn in the names of gods, making them vassals of the Hittite crown. These treaties were not simple demands. They were carefully structured, recording obligations, protections, and punishments. They reveal a ruler who thought not only as a warrior, but as a statesman. And then came an event unlike any other in ancient history. It is known today as the Zananza affair. In Egypt, far to the south, the great pharaoh Tutankhamun had died suddenly, leaving behind his widow, a young queen with no heir to the throne. In desperation, she wrote a letter not to her nobles, not to her generals, but to Suppiluliuma, the king of the Hittites. Her words, recorded by Hittite scribes, are startling. "My husband has died and I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you send me one of them, he shall become my husband. I shall not take a servant of mine to wed." I am afraid. It was an unprecedented request. Never before had an Egyptian queen sought a foreign prince as her husband. Suppiluliuma was cautious. At first, he suspected a trap, but after sending envoys and receiving further assurances, he agreed. He chose one of his sons, Prince Zananza, to travel to Egypt and take the queen's hand. But the story ended in tragedy. As Zananza made his way through foreign lands, he was murdered most likely on the orders of Egyptian officials who feared the thought of a Hittite on the throne of Egypt. When news reached Suppiluliuma, his fury was boundless. He launched campaigns against Egyptian holdings in Syria, capturing territory and enslaving thousands. Yet the dream of uniting two of the greatest kingdoms through marriage was lost forever. The final years of Suppiluliuma's reign were shadowed by misfortune. From the prisoners taken in his wars, perhaps from Egypt, perhaps from Syria, came an invisible enemy. A plague swept through Hatti, striking soldiers, citizens, and even the royal family. The tablets record the king's prayers and laments, begging the gods for relief. But the plague did not lift. In time, it claimed Suppiluliuma himself. Thus ended the reign of the greatest Hittite king, not with defeat in battle, but with a silent killer carried on the breath of captives. Yet his legacy endured. He left behind an empire that stretched wider than ever before, an administration strengthened by treaties and diplomacy, and a dynasty that would continue his vision. His sons would inherit his throne, and though they would face turmoil, the empire he built would last for another century of glory. Suppiluliuma's name echoed long after his death, remembered as the ruler who lifted the Hittites into the ranks of world powers. And though his life ended in sorrow, his reign marked the golden age of the Hittite Empire. So, as we drift into the quiet of night, let us picture him, Suppiluliuma, the warrior, king, standing in his chariot, wind in his hair, the storm god Tarhunt at his side. Around him stretched the lands of Anatolia and Syria, conquered by his will, held by his treaties. Above him, the 1,000 gods of Hatti bear witness. and below him, the whispers of history carry his name, a name that would not be forgotten even in the silence of centuries. Far to the south of Hatti, where the rivers Orontes cut their way through the green valleys of Syria, stood the city of Kadesh. It was an ancient stronghold, coveted by kingdoms for centuries. Whoever held Kadesh controlled not only fertile lands, but the routes of merchants, the pathways of armies, the very bridge between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. For the Hittites, Kadesh was more than a prize, it was a symbol of power. And for the Egyptians, it was the same. Thus, in the 13th century BCE, two empires met there, and the clash that followed would become one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. At this time, the throne of Egypt was held by Ramses II, a pharaoh whose ambition and pride were boundless. He dreamed of restoring Egypt's dominance in the Levant, reclaiming cities that had slipped into Hittite hands during the reign of Suppiluliuma. The jewel of them all was Kadesh. For the Hittites, the king was Muwatalli II, a ruler far less celebrated than Ramses, yet no less cunning. He understood that Egypt's strength lay in its chariots and its propaganda, so he prepared carefully, gathering allies from across Anatolia and Syria, swelling his ranks with thousands of troops. The stage was set. Egypt marched north with banners high. Hatti gathered its strength in silence. The Egyptians, according to their own inscriptions, divided their army into four great divisions: the Amun division, the Ra division, the Ptah division, and the Seth division, each named after a god. Ramses, impatient and eager for glory, led his Amun division ahead of the others, moving swiftly toward Kadesh. But the Hittites were waiting. Here lies one of history's lesser-known twists. Ramses was deceived. Hittite scouts, disguised as deserters, fed him false information. They told him the Hittite army was far away, still days of marching behind. Trusting their words, Ramses camped his men near Kadesh, confident of an easy victory. But Muwatalli's army was already there, hidden behind the city, shielded by the Orontes River. When the Egyptian Ra division followed behind Ramses and approached the city, the Hittites struck. The attack was sudden and devastating. Over 1,000 Hittite chariots thundered across the plain, crashing into the unprepared Egyptians. Dust filled the air, arrows darkened the sky, and the Ra division broke into chaos. Men fled, horses screamed, and the mighty army of Egypt nearly collapsed before the battle had truly begun. For Ramses, it was a moment of peril. He found himself isolated, his Amun division surrounded, his allies scattered. The Hittite chariots pressed hard, driving into the Egyptian lines, threatening to destroy them completely. But here the Egyptians tell their own tale of heroism. According to Ramses' monuments, he prayed to Amun, his god, and charged alone into the fray. With divine strength, he turned back the tide, rallying his troops and holding the line until reinforcements arrived. The truth, of course, is more complex. While Ramses' courage may have been real, it was the arrival of the delayed Egyptian divisions and the support of mercenary allies from Amurru that saved the day. Without them, the pharaoh's army might well have been destroyed. The battle raged until the sun began to sink. Neither side achieved total victory. The Egyptians claimed glory, carving scenes of Ramses' bravery onto temple walls from Thebes to Abu Simbel. The Hittites, meanwhile, retained control of Kadesh itself. The city did not fall to Egypt. In fact, despite Ramses' boasting, the borderlands of Syria remained firmly in Hittite hands. This was the paradox of Kadesh. Both sides declared victory, yet neither side truly triumphed. It was a draw, written in blood and dust. What makes Kadesh extraordinary is not only the battle itself, but what followed. For years, the two empires continued to posture, sending armies and envoys, but neither could dislodge the other. Finally, decades later, a different path was chosen. Under Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, the two powers signed a treaty, the first known written peace treaty in human history. The treaty was engraved on silver tablets and read aloud in both courts. It declared peace, friendship, and mutual defense. If one empire was attacked, the other would come to its aid. It even included provisions for the return of fugitives and promises of eternal brotherhood between the two peoples. One copy, written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, was carved into the walls of Karnak. The other, inscribed in cuneiform, was placed in Hattusa. Today, a replica of that treaty hangs in the headquarters of the United Nations, a reminder that even 3,000 years ago, humanity sought peace after war. But let us return to that day on the fields of Kadesh. The dust still settles. The cries of men and horses fade into the evening air. The Orontes River flows on, indifferent to human struggle. The Hittites march back into the city, battered but unbroken. The Egyptians withdraw, wounded yet proud. And the world remembers their clash not as the triumph of one over the other, but as a symbol of two great powers meeting at the height of their strength. As we drift deeper into the quiet of night, imagine the scene. Thousands of chariots, their wheels cutting into the earth, the glint of bronze under the Syrian sun, the voices of kings carried across the plain, each certain of his destiny. And then, centuries later, the silence only broken by the echo of words written on tablets of silver and clay, the promise of peace, born from the fury of Kadesh. When we think of an empire, we often picture kings in golden thrones, chariots thundering into battle, or great treaties carved into stone. But the strength of the Hittites lay not only in their kings and warriors, it lay in the fabric of their daily life. Behind the walls of Hattusa, in towns scattered across Anatolia, ordinary men and women lived lives both familiar and strange, bound together by laws, faith, and custom. Let us walk quietly into their world. The first thing that strikes us is their laws. Unlike the harsh codes of Babylon, the Hittite laws reveal a people surprisingly pragmatic, even humane for their time. Theft, for example, was not usually punished with death. Instead, the thief had to return what was stolen, often with interest. If a man damaged his neighbor's property, he owed compensation rather than his life. Even more striking is their treatment of violence. In many neighboring kingdoms, murder could mean execution without trial. Among the Hittites, however, justice leaned toward restitution. The family of the victim might accept goods or silver instead of blood. It was not forgiveness, but it was recognition that peace could be restored without endless cycles of vengeance. Some laws, to our modern ears, sound strange. If a pig destroyed someone's field, the owner was required to pay damages. If bees swarmed into another man's hive, the honey belonged to the original keeper. It is in these small details that we see a society concerned with fairness, with balance, with practical solutions to the conflicts of everyday life. Another remarkable feature of Hittite society was the role of women. In much of the ancient world, women were bound by silence, their voices excluded from law and ritual, but in Hatti, women could own property, manage estates, and even initiate divorce. If a husband mistreated his wife, she could leave him and take her dowry with her. At the highest level, the queen bearing the sacred title Tawanana was the equal of the king in religious authority. She led rituals, offered prayers to the 1,000 gods, and signed treaties alongside her husband. Her signature carried the weight of the throne. One queen in particular, Puduhepa, became legendary. Originally a priestess from Kizzuwatna, she married Hattusili III and rose to power not as a shadow, but as a partner. Her correspondence with foreign kings, including Pharaoh Ramses II, shows her as a diplomat of extraordinary skill. She reorganized the pantheon, codified prayers, and left behind one of the most personal voices of the ancient world, a woman speaking with clarity and authority 3,000 years ago. Life for ordinary Hittites was grounded in the rhythms of the land. The plateau of Anatolia was fertile but demanding. Wheat and barley filled the fields, cattle and sheep grazed on rolling hills, wine was pressed from grapes, oil from olives. Food was simple but sustaining. Bread baked in clay ovens, stews of lentils and beans, honey to sweeten meals. Houses were built of mud brick on stone foundations, their walls plastered white, their roofs flat. Inside, families gathered around the hearth, the heart of the home. Children learned skills, early boys, training in farming or soldiering, girls weaving cloth, tending animals, or learning rituals passed from mother to daughter. Festivals brought color to this daily life. The Puruli festival, celebrating the storm god's victory over the serpent of chaos, filled the streets with music, dance, and ritual feasting. Other festivals marked planting and harvest, reminding people that the gods watched over every season. And then, there was technology, the quiet revolution that would change the ancient world: iron. Long before the Iron Age was recognized, the Hittites were working with this mysterious metal. They learned to smelt and forge iron, producing blades harder than bronze, weapons that cut deeper, lasted longer, and held an edge. At first, iron was rare, reserved for kings and rituals, perhaps even considered magical. But slowly, it spread. The secret of iron would outlive the empire itself, shaping the future of civilizations across the world. In society, there was also the presence of slaves, but here again, the Hittites differed from their neighbors. Slavery in Hatti was not always permanent. Many slaves could earn or buy their freedom, and once free, they often blended into society without stigma. This does not erase the harshness of bondage, but it reveals a system where human worth was not entirely erased by chains. The Hittites also left behind traces of their language, pressed into clay tablets in cuneiform script. It is the oldest known written Indo-European language, the ancestor to many tongues spoken today. Their words reveal contracts, prayers, myths, even personal letters. Through them, we hear voices long gone: merchants arguing over trade, soldiers writing home, priests recording omens in the stars. One tablet preserves a prayer of a Hittite king who begged the gods to lift a plague from his land. Another contains the voice of a queen asking the sun goddess to protect her husband in battle. In these fragile fragments, we glimpse their humanity, not only their power, but their fear, their longing, their hope. And so, life in Hatti was a tapestry woven of many threads, laws both strict and merciful, women with voices strong, farmers tied to the land, blacksmiths hammering the dawn of a new age. It was an empire not built solely on conquest, but on the quiet strength of its people. As we let the night settle, imagine the streets of Hattusa, the smell of bread rising from clay ovens, the sound of children laughing in courtyards, the glow of temple fires as priests pour out wine to the gods. Above it all, the stars wheel silently in the Anatolian sky, the same stars that the Hittites once watched, wondering what destiny awaited them. And in that stillness, their world lives again, not in battles alone, but in the heartbeat of daily life. If the Hittite Empire had a soul, it lived within the stones of Hattusa. Nestled high on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by rolling hills and forests, the city rose like a fortress of gods and men. From a distance, travelers would have seen not one wall, but many circling, winding, climbing across the ridges of the land, enclosing a capital as vast as it was formidable. It was not simply a city, it was a statement, a declaration that the Hittites were here, powerful, enduring, and under the watchful eyes of their 1,000 gods. To approach Hattusa was to face its walls. They stretched nearly 6 kilometers, built of massive stone blocks at the base and mud brick above, standing over 30 feet high. Along their length rose more than 100 towers, each a silent sentinel. The walls did not form a perfect square or circle. Instead, they followed the natural rise and fall of the rocky terrain, making the city both secure and harmonious with the land it crowned. 4 monumental gates pierced the defenses. Each was more than a passage, they were symbols carved in stone. At the Lion Gate, 2 great beasts flanked the entrance, jaws open, eyes wide, guardians of the city's strength. The Sphinx Gate held twin figures with human faces and wings spread, half divine, half mystical, protectors of the unseen world. The King's Gate, adorned with a warrior figure, stood as a reminder that kingship itself was bound to Hattusa's stones. And beyond them all lay the secret Postern Gate, a hidden tunnel carved through rock, meant for sudden escapes or silent movements in times of siege. For the weary traveller, entering Hattusa was not simply arrival, it was initiation. Within the walls, the city spread across terraces and slopes. The lower city, at the base, held houses, workshops, and the great temple of the storm god and the sun goddess. The upper city, newer and higher, was filled with smaller temples, each devoted to one of the countless deities the Hittites welcomed into their empire. To walk through Hattusa was to walk through a sacred landscape, each corner consecrated, each stone tied to ritual. The temples were not modest shrines, they were complexes of courtyards, storerooms, and altars. Priests moved among them daily, carrying out offerings of bread, wine, and oil. Sacrifices were performed with solemn care, and the smoke of burning animals or incense curled into the sky, joining prayers in their ascent to heaven. At the very heart of Hattusa lay the royal citadel, a palace, both fortress and residence. Its halls were vast, lined with storerooms that kept grain, wine, and treasures collected as tribute from across the empire. Courtyards rang with the footsteps of guards, the murmurs of scribes, the chanting of priests. Here, the king ruled not only as a warrior, but as judge, priest, and diplomat. Here, queens bearing the title Tawanana presided over rituals, their voices rising with the chanting of hymns. But perhaps the most remarkable treasure of Hattusa was hidden not in its temples, but in its archives. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, carefully inscribed in cuneiform script, were stored in wooden shelves and baskets. On them were laws, myths, treaties, royal annals, instructions for rituals, records of trade, even personal letters. Through these fragile tablets, the Hittites spoke across millennia. It is from these archives that we know of the great treaties with Egypt, of the prayers of kings during plague, of myths where storm gods battled serpents, and of queens who spoke boldly to foreign rulers. In Hattusa, memory itself was written into clay, preserved by fire and time. The life of the city was not only sacred, but practical. Water channels brought fresh streams into cisterns carved deep in rock. Granaries stored grain to endure famine. Artisans crafted pottery, jewelry, and weapons. Merchants traded tin and copper, vital for bronze, and guarded closely the knowledge of iron, the metal that would shape the future. The streets were narrow, winding paths between stone houses and mud brick walls. Children played in courtyards, herds of sheep and goats bleated in pens. Yet always, above this everyday hum, the temples and citadel loomed reminders that this was not just any city. This was the capital of a people who believed their gods lived alongside them. And beyond the city walls, carved into cliffs a short walk away, lay Yazulakaya, the sacred rock sanctuary. Here, the gods themselves were carved in procession upon stone. Dozens of deities march in relief, storm gods with their thunderbolts, sun gods with radiant crowns, underworld spirits with solemn faces. 2 great chambers held these processions, silent ceremonies frozen in rock. It was here that kings may have crowned themselves, priests may have summoned renewal, and the people believed the veil between worlds grew thin. Even today, standing among those carved figures, one feels the weight of eternity, as if the gods of Hatti never truly left. But history is not kind to all cities. Though Hattusa flourished for centuries, it would one day burn. When the sea peoples swept across the eastern Mediterranean, when famine and war weakened empires, Hattusa fell silent. Its gates, once guarded by lions, stood broken. Its temples, once filled with song, lay in ruins. The archives crumbled, the houses collapsed, and the city disappeared beneath soil and time. For centuries, no one remembered its name. It became a ghost, a rumor, a whisper lost in the Anatolian hills. And yet, the stones endured. When archaeologists uncovered Hattusa in the late 19th century, they found not just walls and gates, but the voice of an empire, pressed into clay, waiting patiently to be heard again. Tonight, as we imagine its streets, its temples, its towering walls, we do not see only ruins. We see a living city, priests carrying offerings, queens raising prayers, scribes pressing tablets into wet clay, guards standing beneath lion-carved gates. We see life, faith, and power, entwined within stones that still whisper across 3,000 years. And in that silence, Hattusa breathes again. Every empire carries within it the seeds of its own weakness. For the Hittites, those seeds were not planted by foreign invaders, but by struggles from within, whispers of betrayal, rivalries between brothers, and the fragile line of succession that bound the royal house. The kings of Hatti ruled not only as warriors and priests, but as fathers and husbands. And like all families, theirs was marked by tension. But in the Hittite world, family quarrels could shatter kingdoms. One of the earliest glimpses we have into this turmoil comes from the testament of Hattusili I. In it, the aging king speaks not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a weary man betrayed by his own kin. He laments how his relatives schemed against him, how loyalty crumbled even within the palace walls. He writes of placing his grandson Mushili on the throne, bypassing his own sons, because he believed only the younger generation could carry on the kingdom. It was a decision born of mistrust, and it set a pattern for centuries to come. For the Hittites, the line of succession was never certain. Brothers, nephews, sons all might claim the right to rule, and when they did, the empire trembled. After Mushili, I led his astonishing campaign into Mesopotamia, even sacking Babylon itself. His triumph was cut short. Upon returning to Hattusa, he was assassinated by his own brother-in-law. The throne, once glorious, became a seat of treachery. In the years that followed, power shifted back and forth between rival claimants, each civil war weakening the fabric of the state. The records speak of assassinations, of plots carried out not by enemies at the gate, but by those who shared the royal bloodline. Each king feared not only the armies of Egypt or Mitanni, but the dagger of a relative. Beyond the palace, unrest grew among the nobility and vassals. The Hittite Empire was not a monolith. It was a web of alliances, treaties, and subject states. Lords of Arzawa, Kizzuwatna, and other regions held their lands as vassals, swearing oaths of loyalty sealed by the gods themselves. But loyalty is fragile when ambition stirs. Rebellions flared repeatedly. Some vassals declared independence when they sensed weakness in Hattusa. Others plotted with foreign kings, balancing their allegiance between Hatti, Egypt, and Mitanni, whichever offered the greater advantage. The kings of Hatti had to spend as much energy keeping their allies loyal as they did fighting their enemies abroad. Then came the plague. In the wake of Suppiluliuma's great conquests, prisoners of war carried a sickness back into Anatolia. What began as a shadow soon spread into every corner of the empire. Clay tablets preserve the desperate prayers of kings. "We have sinned before the gods. Let the plague be lifted. Spare our people." But the plague endured for decades, claiming kings, nobles, and peasants alike. The impact was devastating. Armies weakened, harvests declined, and the faith of the people faltered. The gods, once thought to guard Hatti, now seemed distant, silent. Amid this suffering, disputes over the throne only grew sharper. Kings came and went, some ruling only a few years before being struck down by illness or intrigue. The royal family fractured into rival branches, each claiming divine favor. One queen, whose name echoes faintly in the records, was accused of witchcraft and rebellion, showing that even women of the court could be drawn into the bitter storms of politics. The nobility too became restless. Powerful lords sought to carve out their own spheres of influence, defying the central authority of the king. Some withheld troops, others withheld tribute, weakening the empire's unity just as external threats grew stronger. And yet, the Hittites endured. Each crisis seemed ready to topple them, but from the turmoil, new rulers emerged, patching the cracks, reforging the bonds. The empire was wounded, but not yet broken. Still, the price was heavy. Every civil conflict drained resources, every betrayal eroded trust, and every plague year left the population smaller, hungrier, more uncertain. Imagine the atmosphere in Hattusa during these times. The great gates still stood, the temples still filled with offerings, but beneath the surface lingered unease. Whispers in palace corridors spoke of plots. Scribes pressed tablets recording the accusations of treachery. Priests performed rituals to cleanse the land, to call back the favor of the storm god. But the shadow of doubt stretched long. The empire had risen on strength, but inside, its heart was restless. What held it together was not unbroken unity, but a delicate balance one storm away from collapse. And so, as night falls in our telling, picture a weary king seated on his throne in Hattusa. His crown gleams in the torchlight, but his eyes betray sleepless nights. Around him, advisors argue, generals demand more soldiers, priests insist the gods require greater offerings. Beyond the walls, famine and plague press on the people. And within his own family, ambition sharpens like a knife. This was the hidden truth of the Hittites. Their greatest enemy was not always beyond their borders. Often, it was within. The final centuries of the Hittite Empire were not ended by a single battle or a single king's failure. They were undone by a storm that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean, one of the greatest upheavals the ancient world had ever seen. It came from the sea, carried on the prows of strange ships, and it left behind ruins where empires had once flourished. These were the Sea Peoples. We do not know their true names. They did not leave written histories of themselves, only destruction in their wake. Egyptian records speak of them as foreigners from distant islands, warriors with horned helmets and long swords, traveling with wives and children in ox-drawn carts, as if entire nations were on the move. Some may have come from the Aegean, others from the coasts of Anatolia, still others from places long forgotten. To their victims, they were simply a flood, sudden, violent, unstoppable. For the Hittites, already weakened by plague, famine, and internal strife, the arrival of the Sea Peoples was like a final blow to a crumbling wall. The first sign of disaster was not war, but hunger. Clay tablets from Hattusa record letters of desperation. One speaks of a famine so severe that the king begged the pharaoh of Egypt for grain. Caravans once filled with goods now carried only pleas for help. The changing climate, poor harvests, and failing trade routes had left the empire starving. It was in this fragile state that the Sea Peoples came. They struck coastal cities first, raiding ports and cutting off vital supplies. Ships of merchants were seized, harbours burned, and the arteries that connected Hatti to the wider world were severed. Without the flow of tin and copper, bronze weapons became scarce. Without grain from fertile lands, the people went hungry. Then came the wars. Hittite vassal states in western Anatolia collapsed under pressure. One by one, allied cities fell silent, their ties to Hattusa broken. The Sea Peoples were not a single army, but waves of migrating groups, striking unpredictably, joining with local rebels, tearing apart the fragile network of loyalty that held the empire together. The Hittite kings tried to resist. They mustered their chariots, called upon allies, and fortified key strongholds. But their strength was no longer what it had been in the golden days of Suppiluliuma. Every campaign drained resources. Every defeat opened new wounds. Even the great city of Ugarit, a wealthy coastal ally of the Hittites, sent desperate messages as the Sea Peoples approached. Clay tablets found in its ruins preserved their final words, appeals for help, requests for weapons, cries that the enemy was at the gates. But aid never came. Ugarit fell, consumed by fire, its archives buried beneath the ash of its destruction. And then, the storm reached Hattusa itself. The details of its fall are blurred by time, but the silence speaks louder than words. At some point around 1200 BCE, the capital was abandoned. Its gates, once guarded by lions of stone, were broken. Its temples stood empty, their fires cold. The archives ceased to speak. No final records were left, only the hush of ruin. Did the Sea Peoples themselves march upon Hattusa? Or did famine and rebellion finish what the invaders began? Historians still debate. But what is certain is this. The city that had once been the heart of 1,000 gods became a hollow shell, swallowed by forest and soil. While Egypt under Ramses III managed to repel the Sea Peoples in fierce battles along the Nile Delta, the Hittites were not so fortunate. Their empire, already wounded, simply could not withstand the chaos. The Anatolian plateau emptied of power, and new peoples, Phrygians, Assyrians, and others would later rise from its ashes. Yet fragments of the Hittite world survived. In northern Syria, small Neo-Hittite states carried on parts of their culture. Karshemish, for a time, kept alive the traditions of the old empire. But the unity of Hatti, the great empire that had once stood equal with Egypt and Babylon, was gone forever. Imagine it now, in the stillness of night. The walls of Hattusa, blackened by fire, the stone lions, staring out over empty fields, the last prayers of priests rising into a sky that offered no answer. The Sea Peoples vanished into history, their names forgotten, but the silence they left behind marked the end of an age. The Bronze Age world of Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, and Ugarit collapsed like a fragile vessel dropped upon stone. And so, the empire of the Hittites, which had risen on ambition, held by faith, and tested by war, came to its quiet end, not with one final triumph, but with famine, fire, and the restless tide of strangers from the sea. Tonight, as we drift into sleep, we can almost hear that tide still, the creak of ships approaching shore, the clash of bronze swords in the dark, the cries of cities swallowed by flame. The storm of the sea peoples swept away the Hittites, but their memory endures, etched in stone, pressed in clay, waiting in silence until it was uncovered once more. High on the Anatolian plateau, where the winds sweep through oak forests and limestone ridges, the city of Hattusa once stood proud. For centuries, its lion gates guarded an empire, its temples rang with prayers, and its royal palace commanded loyalty from kings near and far. But by the 12th century BCE, those voices began to fade. Hattusa, the heart of the Hittites, was falling silent. The decline had begun long before the final blow. Years of famine had gnawed at the people. The climate grew harsher, harvests failed. Clay tablets from the city record urgent requests for grain shipments, ples sent to Egypt and to coastal allies. When those ships never came, the people of Hattusa tightened their belts, and hunger became a constant companion. Plague had also left its mark. Generation after generation, disease lingered in the city, carried by prisoners of war and traders alike. Even kings were not spared. The once glorious palace was filled not only with feasts and ceremonies, but with whispers of sickness and death. The empire was strained to its limits, and then came the pressure from outside. The sea peoples raiding coasts, rebellious vassals breaking away, Assyrian expansion pressing from the east. It was as if every wall of the empire was being pushed at once. Within Hattusa itself, life grew desperate. The once bustling streets of the lower city, where merchants sold grain and cloth, where potters shaped clay, began to empty. Workshops closed, homes were abandoned. The great temple, where the storm god and sun goddess had been worshipped for centuries, still held rituals, but the offerings were smaller, the priests fewer, the faith overshadowed by fear. The archives, once filled with fresh clay tablets, grew thin. The scribes pressed fewer words into clay. The voices of the empire, its treaties, its prayers, its records, began to fall silent. In time, the fires of Hattusa itself dimmed. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, the city was abandoned. Whether by invasion, famine, or rebellion, no one can say for certain. But the people left. The temples stood empty, the palace crumbled, and the gods of Hatti were left alone in their sanctuaries. Imagine walking through the ruins in those final days. The stone lions at the gates still stare fiercely, but their eyes watch over deserted streets. The market stalls are bare, their roofs collapsing under the wind. In the citadel, chambers once filled with the laughter of courtiers now echo only with silence. The sacred fires are extinguished, the altars cold. It was not a sudden fall, like a city consumed overnight by flames. It was a slow unraveling, one family leaving, then another, until only a handful remained. The empire had been bled dry by decades of war, disease, and hunger, and at last its heart could beat no more. When the last inhabitants left Hattusa, they left behind more than stones. They left behind memory. In storerooms and archives, thousands of clay tablets were forgotten, buried under the dust of centuries. For 3,000 years they lay silent, waiting. The forests crept over the walls. The earth swallowed the streets. To the villages that rose nearby, Hattusa was just an ancient ruin, its true name forgotten, its kings erased from memory. For the world, it was as if the Hittites had never existed, and so, for millennia, the city slept. Travelers passed by the hills, hearing only the wind through the trees, never knowing that beneath their feet lay the remains of palaces and temples. The lion gates stood, weathered by rain and frost, their faces scarred but enduring. They were silent guardians of a secret no one alive could recall. Only in the late 19th century would archaeologists, digging through the earth, bring Hattusa back to light. They uncovered the walls, the gates, the storerooms, and most importantly, they uncovered the tablets, tens of thousands of them, pressed with the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. At last, the forgotten voice of the Hittites could be heard again, but in the moment of its abandonment, there was only silence. Picture the last priest leaving the temple, glancing back at the altar he once tended. Picture the last family walking through the Lion Gate, their belongings packed, the road ahead uncertain. Behind them, the city of kings became the city of ghosts. Tonight, as we let the quiet settle, we can imagine Hattusa as it was in its final breath. Not the roaring capital of empire, but a hushed ruin, already surrendering to time. The lions still stand, but they guard no one. The gods still dwell, but their worshippers are gone. The palace still towers, but its halls are empty. And so the great capital of the Hittites, once rival to Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, passed not with a scream, but with a sigh. A city laid down to sleep, its memory buried, its story waiting to be told once more in the quiet of the night. For more than 3,000 years, the name of the Hittites was lost. Their cities were ruins, swallowed by forest, their kings erased from memory, their gods forgotten. Even the Bible, which mentioned the Hittites in passing, gave only shadows, no clue that they had once been rulers of a mighty empire. Scholars of the 19th century dismissed them as a minor tribe, a people of no consequence. The truth lay hidden beneath the earth, waiting. The rediscovery of the Hittites began not with armies or kings, but with stones and whispers. In the mid-1800s, European travellers wandering through central Anatolia stumbled upon curious ruins near the Turkish village of Boğazköy. They saw massive walls, carved gates guarded by lions, and strange rock reliefs of gods in procession. The villagers called it simply the Old City. No one knew its true name. At first, the ruins were puzzling. Who had built such vast fortifications in this remote plateau? Some guessed it was a forgotten outpost of the Assyrians. Others thought it might be a Phrygian or even a Roman site. The truth was still asleep beneath the soil. Then came the tablets. In the 1832nd and 1842nd, clay tablets with mysterious wedge-shaped marks cuneiform were being found across Mesopotamia. But in Boğazköy, explorers discovered thousands of similar tablets buried in storerooms, half broken but still legible. Here was something different, a language no one recognized. In the late 19th century, German archaeologists led by Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready began large-scale excavations at Boğazköy. They uncovered gate after gate, wall after wall, until the scale of the city became undeniable, and in its heart lay archives of unimaginable size. Over 10,000 clay tablets, inscribed in cuneiform, yet written in a language that defied understanding. This was no provincial town. This had been a capital. The breakthrough came in the early 20th century. A Czech linguist, Bedřich Hrozný, devoted himself to the mystery of the Boğazköy tablets. In 1915, as the world outside was torn apart by the First World War, Hrozný quietly worked through the ancient words. He noticed something peculiar. One line read, "Nu ninda an ezatani, watar ma ikutani." Hrozný compared the words. Ninda seemed to mean bread. Watar looked like water. The structure of the sentence felt familiar. Indo-European, the family of languages that included Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and even English. Then came the revelation. The mysterious tongue of the Hittite tablets was the earliest known Indo-European language. The ancestors of our own words, bread, water, eat, were alive within these ancient texts. It was as if the Hittites were speaking directly to us across 3,000 years. Slowly, their world returned. The tablets spoke of treaties with Egypt, prayers to the 1,000 gods, myths of storm gods battling dragons. They recorded laws, letters, and even personal confessions of kings. The forgotten empire had found its voice again. Hattusa was identified at last as the capital of the Hittite Empire. The gates carved with lions and sphinxes were no longer anonymous. They were the very entrances through which kings and priests once passed. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya revealed itself as a holy site, its rows of gods standing in eternal procession. The story of the Hittites, once lost, was now alive again. For the modern world, the rediscovery was astonishing. It was not only that a lost empire had been found, it was that this empire had stood as an equal to Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon powers once thought to be unmatched. And yet, for centuries, no one had remembered their name. The silence of history had buried them so deeply that their return felt almost like a resurrection. Even today, archaeologists continue to work at Hattusa. They uncover new tablets, new fragments of walls, new glimpses into a world once thought erased. Each discovery adds a thread to the tapestry, weaving back together the story of a people who had lived, fought, prayed, and vanished. Imagine the moment of rediscovery. Scholars brushing away dust from a broken tablet, realizing that the marks upon it were words spoken by a king 30 centuries ago. Imagine Hrozny, sitting in his study, suddenly realizing that bread and water were staring back at him from an ancient language. In that instant, the silence of millennia was broken, and the Hittites spoke again. Tonight, as we listen in the quiet, let us picture Hattusa not as ruin, but as memory awakened. The lion gates stand once more in the light. The temples fill again with chants. The clay tablets whisper their secrets. The forgotten empire is no longer forgotten, and so the Hittites return not in armies or chariots, but in the soft voice of history, carried to us across time, reminding us that nothing is ever truly lost. When an empire vanishes, it is tempting to think it has left nothing behind. The walls fall, the temples burn, the kings are forgotten, but the Hittites, though their cities sank into silence, left echoes that still shape the world we know today. Their legacy is not measured only in stone, but in the words, laws, and ideas that survived them. Perhaps their greatest gift was the idea of peace through words, not swords. Long before modern diplomacy, the Hittites carved treaties onto clay and silver. The most famous of these was their peace agreement with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh. It promised eternal brotherhood between two empires that had once clashed on the fields of Syria. The treaty spoke not only of peace, but of alliance, of mutual defense, of returning fugitives, a vision of international law in an age where most disputes ended only with blood. Today, a copy of that treaty hangs in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. It is a reminder that 3,000 years ago, when empires rose and fell in fire, there were those who believed in the power of words to end war. The Hittites also left behind their laws. More than simply rules, their legal codes reveal a society guided by balance and pragmatism. Unlike the brutal punishments of some neighbors, the Hittites often favored restitution over execution. If harm was done, it could be repaired with compensation. If property was lost, it could be restored. Even slaves, under Hittite law, had certain rights and could in some cases earn their freedom. These laws remind us that even in a world of kings and conquerors, there were voices seeking fairness, order, and humanity. Another legacy lay in the realm of faith. The Hittites were called the people of 1,000 gods. And though their empire fell, their myths and rituals spread. Stories of storm gods fighting dragons echoed across cultures. In Mesopotamia, in Greece, in later traditions, we find reflections of these tales. The Hittites were bridges of myth, passing legends from one civilization to another, carrying stories like torches through the night. Their openness to foreign gods also left a subtle lesson. An empire could unite not by destroying local beliefs, but by embracing them. In a world often fractured by religion, the Hittites had already practiced a form of tolerance, but perhaps their most enduring mark was in metal. The Hittites were among the earliest to master the secrets of working iron. At first, iron was rare, used for ritual daggers and gifts for kings, but the knowledge spread, and slowly, bronze gave way to a harder, stronger age. The Iron Age dawned first in Anatolia, in the lands once ruled by the Hittites. Though their empire fell, the metal they pioneered reshaped warfare, farming, and daily life across continents. In this way, the Hittites lit a torch they could not themselves carry forward, but others did. Their language, too, left a quiet legacy. When Bedřich Hrozný deciphered their words in the early 20th century, he revealed the earliest written Indo-European language ever known. The Hittite tongue is a distant ancestor to many of the languages we speak today. In their clay tablets we hear the echoes of our own words: bread, water, eat. They remind us that the voices of the past are not as far from us as they seem. Even their memory of kingship has weight. Hittite rulers saw themselves not as divine beings, but as mediators between gods and men. The king was chief priest, yes, but also accountable before heaven. In their oaths and prayers, kings admitted guilt, confessed failures, begged forgiveness. It is rare in ancient history to find monarchs speaking so vulnerably, so humanly. Through them, we glimpse a kind of humility seldom preserved in the annals of power. And so, though Hattusa fell silent, the Hittites did not vanish completely. They lived on in the Neo-Hittite kingdoms of Syria, in myths passed across cultures, in the spread of iron, in the oldest written words of our language family. They live even now, in museums where their tablets are read, in universities where their history is taught, in the quiet halls of the United Nations where their treaty with Egypt still hangs as a symbol of peace. As we close our journey through their story, let us picture them not only as conquerors or victims of fate, but as people who sought to bring order to chaos, meaning to faith, and fairness to law. They were not perfect, no empire is, but their legacy is written in ways subtle and profound. And tonight, as the world outside grows quiet, we can almost hear them still. The scratch of a scribe's stylus across wet clay, the murmur of a queen praying to the sun goddess, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer striking iron, the echo of lions carved in stone, guarding gates that no longer open. The Hittites remind us that history does not end when cities fall. It lingers in treaties, in stories, in the very words we speak. Their empire is gone, but their voice, once lost to silence, has returned, and it whispers to us across the centuries that nothing is ever truly forgotten.